top 20 banks in the world, the top 5 are Chinese. Ray.
Well, you mentioned I've been there 30 years and I've watched it evolve. And I think there are two types of things that are going on. Let's call them the short term and the long term, right? As I say, productivity is the big thing in the long term, and that's the real big thing. And then you have these short-term debt cycles, and you have these short-term things. So the two things that are happening short-term is that you're having a deleveraging that you so articulately dealt with. There was an over-leveraging, and there was a development of the financial markets. When not long ago, it was really 5 or 6 years ago, 5 major banks loaned money to state-owned enterprises, and the money was clogged at the top. Then there was the development of the shadow banking system and the liberalization of that, and then now put into place regulation. Whenever you're having a deleveraging, that is something that makes the country healthier because you're deleveraging, but it has a short-term effect, but it has a long-term positive. So there's the deleveraging happening, it's a short-term thing, and then there's the trade issues associated with that, which is also a short-term thing. But if you take productivity growth, if you take the approach, and I think it really has to be admired as, Chinese characteristics as it's described. It's a certain top-down, it's a cultural challenge for the West, but there's a top-down way of setting a mission for 2025 plan or a plan and working those things in a top-down way with unique resources available that has produced in the time that I've been there, an increase of 20 times in incomes. The movement of, it used to be the below poverty level, it's 88% of the population was below poverty level. Today it's less than 1%. There is an ability to produce productivity, but it's a culture clash with the West. Because, in some ways, because there, as one of the leaders described it to me, the United States is a country of individualists, and individual is working that up. China is more of a country that is an extension of the model of the family. He said, there's the word country in China represents state family. And if you go back to Confucianism and how it is run top down, and that is where there's an element of a culture clash. At the same time, when you look at that productivity and the policies and things, it's a very effective place. So I would say it's important to distinguish the short-term influences from the longer-term productivity influences, and then recognize that we're now in a world where there is a competition, and that can mean conflict in different dimensions between the two countries. That means, I think the trade issue is a manageable issue. I think the way of being issue is a challenging issue, because you can't expect, Americans can't expect Chinese to operate in a way that is different from that, or vice versa. So I think that's the bigger, longer term issue. But I think you'd have to be very optimistic when you think of even a 5 or 6% growth rate and what that's going to mean and what the world will look like in 10 or 20 years. It'll be quite a different world in which China is going to be, I think, a lot stronger. So I think that's the picture. Let's not confuse the short term with that bigger picture, evolutionary picture, in the light of the rises and declines of reserve currencies in the world and the normal patterns. And if you look at it from the Dutch guilder, the British pound, and the US dollar, and now China, and how countries evolve, and you look at those patterns over a series of history, we know that, first of all, technology is the leading reason for the developments. We know that each of those countries has to go global with their currency and their banks. We know that they have to develop their financial markets. Every one of those has had a financial center. Amsterdam was, London was, New York was, and now in China they must have their financial markets. We know that opening up helps their balance of payments, and it also helps the development of the renminbi as a reserve currency, the going global of China. That will happen. That's an inevitable part of the development. Simultaneously, though, we have to look at the United States, and we have to think of its implications. There is a cycle that this happens. The rises of these reserve currencies happen because the countries become more competitive, technologies and all of those things, balance of payments, and they go global. The declines of world reserve currencies happen quite often because they have reserve currencies. There's a lot of lending to them. And in the United States, we have to talk about the United States and the United States debt, government debt. We're talking a lot about China, and that's part of that puzzle, a big part of that puzzle. But we also have a real problem in terms of the quantity of debt that we're going to have to sell to the rest of the world over the next few years. We've experienced a lot of stimulation because of a combination of the tax cuts and the stimulation. If you do the projections, the pro forma projections, and think who's going to buy that amount of debt and the amount of debt that we have to sell, I think that that's going to be an issue. So when we're talking about the balance, I think the normal evolution will be globalization, in which I would characterize China as basically allowing very free markets in many ways within boundaries, and then not to let it go outside of that boundary of volatility. So if I was to take a foreign exchange policy, you will have more freedom, but you'll have boundaries, so it can't go beyond those boundaries, which I think is a good thing. And then, but you're going to have that globalization, you're going to have the development of the currency, and there is a problem or a challenge in terms of debt, which relates to the currency issue, because a bond is a promise to deliver a lot of currency. It's just basically a pile of currency spread over a period of time. And I would say that if you were to take a longer term perspective, 2 or 3 or 4 years, that's going to be an issue.